Oh, now we are.
I'm
Nice.
sorry, I forgot the recording, but I put it on now. I hope that's okay. Sorry.
So today's question is, that we'll be discussing is building intersectional climate justice movements. How do we get there and where are we now? So earlier, you all were really kind and already started to answer some of these icebreaker questions. So I just want to go ahead and read some of them as a way for us to process them together. So Fanny is from Sweden, living in, I can't pronounce that, Ekoping. I'm sorry, I know I said that wrong. Want to learn more about how to use intersectionality and how to introduce more people to think about intersectionality. We have Kara attending from Manila/Portland, hoping to gain a new perspective on how to tackle climate justice in your community. We have a cute dog in the mix as well who says hi. So really amazing participants today, and I'm glad that we have all these things to learn. And don't worry if you didn't send it in the chat. There'll be plenty of more opportunities to interact during this presentation. So a little quick overview of what we'll be discussing today. We're already partially through the login, welcome, and introduction, so good job, everyone. We'll be talking a little bit about what I like to call environmentalism exhaustion. Then we'll move into defining intersectionality, talking about how intersectionality helps us in doing community-centered climate justice work, and then go into a Q&A and discussion period. And also, thank you for sharing, Bella. You're also from Hungary, hoping to learn from intersectionality, and especially relevant today as Europe is facing an energy crisis. Excellent. Well, welcome to the call. Okay, so moving on here. I wanted to give you a little bit of information about myself because I always think it can be a little awkward when someone comes in and starts talking to you about things and you don't really know anything about them. So just to give you a little bit of a background of who I am. I was born and raised in Wisconsin in the USA, so that's kind of near Chicago in the Midwest, in case people aren't familiar, and identify as Taiwanese American. Fun story, I actually grew up going to a fundamentalist evangelical church, which I can go into another time, but as a result of that, in addition to my college experience of doing Asian American organizing, I'm really, really passionate about spaces for critical education and growth, as well as forming community spaces, which is one of the reasons why I think a lot about intersectionality. After I finished my undergrad, I moved to Taiwan, where I did ethnographic research with migrant care workers. And then through that process, I really appreciated learning about slow learning and understanding new concepts through relationships. And then currently, I work at Greenpeace International, as I said. And what I love about doing communications and engagement, especially in the age of COVID and post-COVID, is that it's essentially how we exist and form relationships with each other. So I really enjoy doing this work because I think relationship building, as we'll talk about today a lot, I'm a firm believer that we're only as strong as our relationships. So communication and engagement become really important in all of that. Welcome to the call, Nelly. A couple of things really quickly. If you're able to, I'd really appreciate if you can turn your camera on, just because I love being able to see how people are reacting to things. And then we're also doing a really quick introduction in the group chat, which is just where are you from and what's one thing you want to learn today? Don't worry about the second question. We'll talk about more of that later. So go ahead and feel free to share that if you are willing. But yeah, the last thing about my introduction is that this is my cat. His name is Gugu. Usually he would hop into a call by this point and start screaming, but as I'm visiting the Netherlands right now, he's not here. So we are able to have our call in relative peace and quiet. But yeah, so before we go into the tofu of today's call, as I know some people like to say instead of the meat of today's call, I thought we should really quickly go through some community guidelines. So I really hope that today will be more of a discussion and more of an opportunity to ask some questions about intersectionality and have in-depth discussion. But in order to do that well, I think it's really important that we establish some community guidelines on how we have these conversations. So I put down a couple that I like to use when I have conversations. One is using I statements. So when we are talking about our experiences, like saying words like, I feel that something, something, I think that something, something, I find that really helps to keep us centered on our own experiences instead of projecting it onto others. If you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand on Zoom or also send them into the Zoom group chat. I found the presentation is much more interesting if you feel free to, if you ask questions at random points even, because it makes it feel more like a conversation. And I don't want to be like a professor lecturing for 2 hours straight. So please ask questions. If I'm speaking too fast, please let me know, which is a commuting guideline now, I guess. Also, try to share time and space equitably. So if you notice that you're taking up a lot of space in the conversation or that you're not taking up that much space, you can be brave if you want and try to like contribute more to the conversation or maybe step back from the conversation. But you know, your own comfort level is what's most important here. And then lastly, we have assume positive intent, name and own impact. So what this means is when we are, let's say someone says something that seems a little insensitive, we can assume that they probably didn't mean to like hurt us, but we should still name the impact that they had on us and let them know that, hey, like you just did this and I felt this way in response. And then it's better if you accidentally hurt someone to try to own that impact and be like, oh, I'm sorry, like I didn't mean to do that. Can I learn something more? So these are a few of the community guidelines that I like to use. Is there anything else you all think that we should put in today to have a good conversation discussion? And if so, you can feel free to put it into the group chat. And if you put it in a minute or two, because it takes a second to type things out, I will add that to our community guidelines in a moment. But yeah. Okay, so first we're going to have a little bit of movement for our call today. So I like to do what we call temperature checks, so just seeing where people are at on some things so we can better understand who is in our conversation today. So if you are not super familiar with intersectionality, I'm going to have you go ahead and do like a peace sign on camera. And if you feel like you have a basic understanding and you want to learn more, then we can go ahead and do this on camera. And then if you're like, I have a really good understanding and I'm excited to share with others, you can go ahead and do this. Feel free to, don't worry, feel free to, if you're like this or if you're like this, it's all good. No matter what, you are here to contribute to this conversation. It's going to be really great. I'm going to put myself in the middle still, with maybe a slight hand up, but still with a lot to learn. Okay, so most of us are kind of in the same spot, like in the middle, we have basic understanding and we want to learn more. Excellent. Let's go to the second concept. So climate justice, same thing. So not familiar, basic understanding, really good understanding. Okay, cool. Lovely. I find that most of ourselves end up picking this thing in the middle, and that makes me really happy actually, because it shows that people here understand that, hey, like, you know, I have some good knowledge, but I am ready to learn more, and there's always more to learn. So I think that makes everyone here should give themselves a high five for being in a really good learning mood. Yes, thanks for sharing, Kari. Everyone does come from their own places of learning and unlearning. And that is probably why we all chose the middle. Oh, that is a good community guideline. Everyone comes from their own place of learning and unlearning. Thank you for sharing, Kara. All right. So with that, that helps us go into the meat of, or the tofu of today's conversation. Okay. So first I want to talk about something which I like to call environmental exhaustion or environmentalism exhaustion. I don't know about y'all, but oftentimes when I hear narratives about environmentalism, it often seems like I, as an individual, am expected to somehow solve the weight of all of the global systems of capitalism or neocolonialism that lead to like the climate crisis that we're in right now. So I remember, I don't know if you've seen this on Twitter, but like, or whatever social media you're on, but as of July 2022, celebrities using private jets produced an average of 3,376 metric tons per person. In comparison, the average person produced 7 metric tons of CO2 annually. So that means that as of July, celebrities produced 482 times more than an average person's annual emissions in just 7 months. So when thinking about like doing climate justice work as an individual, sometimes I kind of look at that type of ratio of like, oh yes, there's me, the one person who's like recycling my bottles and trying to stop using plastic straws. And then there's these celebrities with their private jets. There's the US military with like producing 1/3 of the carbon emissions of the world or whatever. There's all these other things. And I'm like, what am I supposed to do in response to this? Like me recycling 1 bottle is not going to prevent the world from burning. And I think that the narrative of this type of environmentalism work, where it's like our individual actions have to combat this whole global system of climate change and all of the other systems of oppression around the world, I think it can feel really disempowering. I think it can feel really like we can lose hope. Sometimes it feels like no matter what actions I take, it might not have an impact on this huge global problem. I also felt that this narrative of environmentalism was really disconnected from my community and my local reality. So when I was an undergraduate student, I used to do a lot of community organizing around Asian American issues at my university. So at the time, like we were organizing for community spaces, cultural centers, and basically resources that would allow Asian American students to feel more supported and safe on their campus, because I was like, you know, if we don't have a place where we can feel safe and that we feel like we can grow and thrive, then we won't be able to survive on this campus and stay in school and graduate, etc. So I remember one day I was like walking up a hill and like seeing these folks doing environmentalist protesting against things like a plastic straw ban at that time. And at the same time, that was like during the Black Lives Matter movement in the US. So I had friends who were going out in the streets and getting pepper sprayed and beaten by police as they were fighting for this. So for me, I was thinking like, I know that climate change will affect my communities and the places I hold dear most in the future. But in the context of choosing which battle I want to fight right now, where I want to put my energy and time, I'm going to choose the battles that allow my communities to stay alive in the present. So like, I think this narrative of individual versus global environmentalism, where it like pits our individual actions and choices versus these global problems, it doesn't feel necessarily relevant to our local communities and our local realities. And I think this is even more concerning, given that research shows how climate change disproportionately impacts communities of color, poor communities, and different groups of systemically marginalized or like historically marginalized people around the world. So I want to just check in here because everyone has their own experience, and maybe some people have felt this way, some people haven't really felt this way. So in today's call here, let's do another quick temperature check. So how many people have felt this like environmentalism? I feel like this narrative is pretty disconnected from my local reality or community. And how many people feel like, no, I actually feel like it's pretty connected. So if you feel like it's pretty connected, you can just go ahead and do a peace sign. If you feel like sometimes it feels connected, sometimes not so much, then you can do the hands up in the middle again. And if you're like, it often feels pretty disconnected from me, then you can go ahead and just put one hand up like this. Well, I'm glad to see I'm not the only one who sometimes feels like these narratives are really disconnected. So I feel like this disconnection really highlights the importance of us shifting to climate justice, because in my view, climate justice holds community at the heart of change. So like community becomes this place, this space in between like the individual and the global, where individuals are able to impact our communities and communities are able to impact the global systems. Obviously, the reverse is true, like global systems impact our communities, which impact us as individuals. But I think having this space in the middle of community is really important because it becomes a space of possibility of making change. And when we think of our communities as that space of possibility, I think climate change moves from being like this, what do I need to do to stop the earth from burning right now, to this question of, oh, what does climate change become a catalyst for? Like, what does climate change encourage me to do to support the people I care about? How can I support my community in a way that leads to sustainable growth? Not just protecting against the effects of climate change, but also allowing them to thrive in general. So like in that regards, community becomes this really powerful space for climate justice. Olga says, I'd add society between community and global. So it's individual, community, society, global. Yeah, that is a really good point. We'll go into that a little bit more for the next part. Because you're absolutely right that it's not as cut and dry in this as just like, obviously there are multiple layers where we could say like, there's individual, family, neighborhood, community, city, state. The fun part about social groups is that they're we can draw them however we want to, essentially. But I think for today's, like, let's quickly go into this idea of thinking about ourselves as individuals who belong to communities, whether those are smaller communities or larger communities, or like physical communities, or like, maybe even national communities. And then all are part of this big global systems. And Kara says, I have some friends who share the same, more environment-centered values, but we never do anything as a community. Yeah, so we can go into that a little bit later as well. I promise we'll get to that. Okay, so climate justice, it's focused on community. Hold on, I'm definitely going to mess up my slides a moment here. Okay. So I think climate justice, like this focus on community and particularly our relationships with our community, is where intersectionality becomes really useful for us as a way of thinking and understanding the world around us and the communities around us. So before we start going into the definitions of intersectionality, I was wondering if I could invite people to share a few words or phrases that come to their mind when we talk about intersectionality. Some people in the previous session brought up things like race or collaborating or power systems, but I'm sure that we can add on to that as well. So we can go ahead and take maybe a minute or two, and feel free to just type that into the Zoom chat, or you can also unmute yourself and share because there's not many of us in the call right now. We have Kara saying ways identities overlap. Wow, and my typos begin. We have Julia saying people from different socioeconomic backgrounds collaborate. Amazing. Nelly talks about backgrounds and identities, having multiple identities. That's very good. Does anyone else want to share? Maybe one or two more. Class exploitation, the complexity of a problem. It is really complex. When I wrote my thesis about how intersectionality manifests within the public health system, and I swear I had like an existential crisis almost every day as I was trying to figure out how to talk about this. We suddenly have a lot that I'm trying to copy and paste really quick, oppressing and being oppressed. Someone's been reading ahead / attended the previous session. Oppression, very good. Position and perception. Ooh, I love that. Perception. I want to hear more about that in a bit. And then structures interacting. Okay. I'm a little curious about a couple of your answers here. Olga, would you mind sharing a little bit what you meant about complexity of the problem?
Well, I meant like, maybe I'm wrong about this, and maybe I don't know, interpreted intersectionally badly, but as I see it, intersectionality means that one problem or one special issue is connected to other problems, and so you can never I don't know, solve a problem if you just see one side of it. You have to see the economical side, the ecological side, the side of the society, etc. So you have to see every problem as a complex thing. Yeah, I meant something like that.
Yeah, that's absolutely perfect. Thank you for sharing. Remember, in our space today, we are being brave and recognizing that we are coming from places of learning and unlearning. So feel free to share because we can all learn from each other. Kara, would you mind talking what you meant by position and perception?
Yeah, sure. Is my mic okay? Can you hear me? Okay, great. Also, Olga, thank you for that contribution. I feel like that also kind of comes to my mind when I think of intersectionality. So I felt like your explanation of complexity of a problem really like relates to it. And so I guess when I wrote position perception, I was thinking about how like a different intersecting identities affect like the position we have in different contexts. And then so those identities also affect how others may perceive us. And so I wanted to kind of come up with a dual phrasing of words that kind of encompass like a person, but also how like you're viewed by other people. So like internal and external. But yeah, I hope that makes sense. But I think it could also apply to like what Olga's saying with the complexity of problems, like when you think about how they overlapped or the different sides of a problem, and then you think about what position that puts it in, and then how it's perceived by other people because of the different layers and aspects, if that makes sense at all. But yeah, that's what I was thinking about when I wrote down this phrase.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I like how our workshop here, our participants here are already collaborating with each other and how we are coming up with our answers. Great. Thank you all for sharing. This is a really cool little mind map of what words and phrases come to our minds when we're thinking about intersectionality. I think hopefully we will talk about a lot of these in the next in this next section here, in the next 2 or 3 sections here. But yeah, let's go ahead and go into the textbook definition. So intersectionality, as a lot of you have kind of brought up, was a term that is the term that kind of points to the study of overlapping or intersecting social identities and related systems of oppression, domination, or discrimination. So those related systems often refer to things like sexism, racism, classism, like the global north-south, these types of different systems of oppression that have not helped, but have made the world into the way that it is today. And intersectionality was first coined in 1989 by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is this really amazing lawyer and civil rights advocate who kind of she coined this term in this case where essentially they were trying to show that Black women not only have a very unique experience in labor laws, because even if there's protections for Black folks, even if there's protections for women, when these identities intersect, there are certain ways that Black women were exploited that weren't covered and protected under law. So it's a really interesting case study. I would recommend that you go read it if you have time, but I won't be going too much into that today, but would recommend. So I also like to think of intersectionality as basically that we experience multiple systems of oppression at once. You know, we all exist within these systems of racism, sexism, homophobia, classism, etc. And I want to make clear that regardless of whether you are affected positively or negatively by these systems, you still exist within them. So many people, including myself in the past, think of intersectionality as a way of calculating like how oppressed or privileged individuals are. So I kind of illustrated this here. And this is, by the way, for those who are academics, this is called like the an additive understanding of intersectionality. But if you're not, then don't worry about that. But basically what this means is like, instead of thinking of these different systems as overlapping in how they've like generated and created the world, it kind of separates the systems into different pieces. So it's like, oh, the system that maybe has led to homophobia and anti-queer violence, that's one system on its own. And then classism, that's its own system on its own. And then like sexism and violence against gender minorities, that's its own oppressive system. So some folks kind of think like, oh, well, if I'm straight, or then maybe I have a lot of power in the system. If I'm queer, then I don't. If I'm high class, then I have power and because I have money or whatever. And then if I'm low class, then maybe not. If I'm male, then maybe, oh God. If I'm male, then maybe I have more power. And then if I'm female or a gender minority, then maybe I don't. So while that is, I think, like an important step in like breaking apart our social identities is really helpful for like thinking about how we exist in the world, intersectionality is really, well, powerful in that it recognizes that these systems actually overlap, like systems of racism, sexism, all these things, they overlap and interact with each other to produce unique experiences for people based on their identities. So Kimberly Crenshaw actually writes about this when she says that intersectionality is an analytic sensibility, a way of thinking about identity and its relationship to power. So I hope, like, hold on, I'm lost in my slides for a second. Oh yeah, here we go. So I think that like thinking about it as a way of thinking, as opposed to a way of measuring our like privilege or our oppression, is really useful because this allows us to examine how we interact with our communities and the world around us. I say communities because our identities are ultimately ways of understanding how we form our relationships with the people around us. I don't know how many of you are familiar or have seen something like this before. Oftentimes in social justice education, they use what they call an identity circle to let people kind of separate their social identities and think about like which social identities they belong to or have. So I think like this little thing of separating all of them kind of feels very similar to this, where we're pulling them all apart and just so we can kind of, deconstruct who we are. But what I think is really cool is that in reality, our definition of these different social identities are based in the communities that we exist in. So for example, myself, I'm an Asian American trans lesbian who migrated to Taiwan. Thus, I consider myself part of the Asian American community. I consider myself part of the lesbian community, the trans community, the migrant community. And it's not like these communities are all like separate from each other. Like, it's not like I only have my Asian friends. I only have my trans friends who are suddenly raceless and genderless. Who are have no sexual, but like, these groups actually these communities overlap with each other and they interact with each other. So like, I think that while deconstructing our identities into like these little axes or like this circle is helpful, in reality, it's a lot more powerful to think of our identities as the communities that we belong to. And if we think of, so that's why I have it like this. So like, if I think of the yellow one as my like Asian American identity, and then this one as my trans identity, this one as my like lesbian identity, this one as my migrant identity, like I belong, and then this little dot here is me. Like I belong to all these different communities here, and yeah, they overlap and they intersect. And like, let's say that when I travel into, like, let's say if I go to my Asian American community or like Asian American events, there might be less the other people here of like more of my other identities. Like there might be less lesbian folks or trans folks or migrant. Well, this is kind of overlaps a lot more actually. But like, even so, because I exist at the intersection of all these communities, that means that I actually act as a connecting point for all these communities as well, which is something that is really exciting when we're coming to think about climate justice. So, like I said, identities are ultimately ways of understanding our relationships with the people and the communities around us. So this moves us from the understanding of intersectionality as like our oppression calculator to intersectionality as a way of understanding who is in our multiple communities, which communities we belong to, how they interact with each other in our local context, who has more power and who has less power. And I think this is ultimately a very freeing way of understanding the world and thinking about how we exist in the world. The reason I say that is because, oops, one slide ahead. Patricia Hill Collins, who's another amazing scholar, offers us a really wonderful freeing perspective when she adds on to Kimberly Crenshaw's idea of intersectionality. Sorry, I'm going into academic mode because I'm citing all the people, but I think it's important to cite these scholars too, because they did a lot of work in creating these ideas. But she reminds us that we all exist within these different overlapping systems, which generate unique experiences for us as individuals and as communities. And then really key, she writes that as a result, we are both the oppressor and the oppressed. So what I like to do to think about this is to recognize that our identities actually shift a lot based off of the communities and the contexts that we're in. So me personally, like, you know, growing up in the Midwest of the US where there's, it's like very, very white. There's not a lot of Asian people like me, not a lot of other people of color. So I always felt like I was like a racial minority growing up. But later I moved to Taiwan, where pretty much everyone always looks like me. And suddenly this idea of me being a racial minority became a lot less relevant. I was like, how do I think about race when everyone looks like me? So like, you can kind of picture it if this blue circle here is Taiwan, this blue circle here should be the US. And then this, red circle here is Taiwan. Like in the US, maybe I existed in like a lower, like I had less power in like using the systems of oppression and within these like different systems of oppression because I was like a racial minority. I am a gender minority and like all these other things. But when I moved to Taiwan, suddenly I'm this person who looks like everyone else, but has an American passport. And that in itself gives me a lot of power. The fact that I had higher education, that I spoke English as my first language, this all like makes it so I suddenly become a person of power or relative power within that context. So that's why I think it's really, really important to recognize that like our identities and the amount of power that we have does actually change based off the context that we're talking about. And the reason I think it's really important to recognize this is because when we are talking about climate justice, we are talking about global problems. So we need to recognize and have the ability to think about who we are in these different contexts, what communities there are in these different contexts, and the amount of power that we have if we're thinking at both like a local, a community, or a global level. And that's why intersectionality is important, because it's a way of understanding who's in our communities, how they interact with each other, and they all exist within this green circle that I'm going to call the globe, even though it's just a green circle. But yeah, so that actually moves us into our climate justice section. But before we go into that, I want to stop to see if we have any questions or if people don't understand something, because this is a really complicated topic, like I said, which almost destroyed my brain when I tried to like think about it in context of other things. So let's take a moment here and just see how people are feeling. If you have any questions or any comments too.
Hi. Yeah, may I go ahead?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, hello, I'm Nara from Armenia. Yeah, I just wanted to comment on this because when I was trying to post, I'm the communications manager for Planet One from Armenia. And when I was trying to post about the event, I realized that we don't even have the Armenian equivalent for this word. And it was like a surprise to me. And I was trying to figure out how to put that into words in Armenian for people to be to know what it's going to be about. And it was way too complicated for me. So I chose not even the fast version. I just went with the English word in an Armenian text. Every word was in Armenian, just this word. was in English, and it was pretty complicated. So I think one of the reasons why we don't have the equivalent of the word in Armenian is because nobody really speaks about it, and it is not like a known term for the public. That's why we don't even have a translation for the word. So it was an interesting remark on our end.
That is a really good and relatable point. In Greenpeace work, we have this term that we use to talk about like social justice work and equity and diversity. And then like, it's really funny because we'll like throw this word around, but no one actually knows exactly what it means, because it just contains like these social justice buzzwords. First of all, they can be understood a bunch of different ways. And then second of all, it's all based off of like an American or Eurocentric context in terms of like how these social justice terms are developed. So I think another part of intersectionality that's really important is like this focus on the community, like thinking about how we define like the systems of oppression that affect our local communities. Like that takes that takes people being critical about where they are and like who their communities are. We will go into this a little bit in the next section, I think. I hope that it'll be a little helpful for you as well. But before we go into the next section, I just wanted to still make sure that if other people want to share or have any questions, comments, you can go ahead and share here. Yeah, I do not know how to say intersectionality in Mandarin, which is my other language. So that's something I should probably look up when I get off this call. Okay, great. In that case, let's move on to the final section, which is our climate justice and intersectionality part. So returning to climate justice, I think it's important to ask, how does intersectionality then, this idea of that way of thinking about how we relate to our communities and the people around us, how does this intersectionality inform how we do climate justice movements? So for me, by the way, I kind of define climate justice as the enabling of our communities to envision and co-create a social and environmentally just future. I have the words envision and co-create there intentionally. Envision because I think it's important for us to be able to dream of futures for our communities. And then co-create because the act of making it and actually doing it is its own separate action that sometimes usually doesn't actually meet the full dream or the vision, but the fact that we have a vision and we have the present reality, these two things in tension, like I love that because it keeps us moving forward and it keeps us hopeful too. So let me check my notes because I lost where I was, haha. So we've now like recognized that our communities are this place of change and possibility for the climate justice movement, because it's a place where we as individuals can make the most impact, as opposed to like my one plastic straw versus Shell oil, like I lose. But I think the question now becomes, okay, so if we are focusing on the community, how do we go about making empowering impact in our community? How can intersectionality or understanding how these power systems impact our interaction with the world and our communities inform our justice work? Now, the bad news is there is no one easy answer, because, if there was, we probably would not be in the climate crisis and in these areas of social injustice now today. But I did my best to kind of give us a little step-by-step guide of maybe some things actions that we can take to start doing this type of work. So number one, I recommend that people who want to do intersectionality informed climate justice work, that we first take the time to map our communities and spaces. So for this, it's asking questions like, what communities do you belong to? How do you interact with these communities? Do you interact with them like in person? Do you do it digitally? Are you a student? Are you a teacher? Like what type of role do you have? Do I feel like people listen to me in that community? Why or why not? And I think when we're identifying these communities that we belong to, we can also try to think of where do people in our communities go to find each other. So like for me, like going back to what did I write earlier about who I am? Going back to who I am as an Asian American trans lesbian migrant of many identities here. Like when I'm mapping my communities here, I want to think, where do the Asian American folks go to hang out with each other and feel safe and to resist against places? Where do the lesbian folks go? Where do the Asian trans lesbians go? Where do the trans migrants go? Where do the Asian American migrants go? Like for me, I'm thinking about not only the communities at a single level, but also where they intersect with each other. Ooh. So I think that's a really good first step because it lets us both understand ourselves better and also the communities that we belong to. The second step is identifying threats to our communities. So I like to use this idea of a watershed, which is essentially how water interacts with the place where water interacts with land, whether that's like on an island or if that's, you know, on a large continent, it's like this area of the earth. So due to climate, I recently attended this climate justice conference where they talked about on a lot of coastal islands, right, or island coasts right now, like there are areas that are vulnerable due to climate change and the rising sea levels. So we start to see that different areas, particularly and places that are already vulnerable, are in danger of getting like wrecked by this rising water. However, there are like things that the communities can do to like protect their land and to kind of plan for how to protect their community as the water rises. But before we get to that, let's focus on the water ourselves. So like, I like to think of it in both of a literal and metaphorical sense. So like, what does climate change reveal as about your community in terms of its inequalities, or like what's going wrong in your community, or like what types of inequalities or injustices are currently threatening the communities that you belong to. So identifying these are really important because, you know, that helps us figure out what we need to change in order to like do this climate justice thing. The third part is to do, what are the strengths of your communities? So kind of like I started explaining, like even though there's this water rising, there in the watershed metaphor or this like land metaphor, there are like root systems, there are trees, there are different things that are holding the land together. So even if the water rises, there are ways that the community can be safe and the land can be safe too. So a lot of times I find that when people start to do any type of justice work, they'll think, oh, no one else is doing anything about this. I'm the only person, I have to start it by myself. That is also what, when I first started doing Asian American organizing, I was like, why aren't Asian Americans caring about like these different social justice issues? And then I like realized as I started to do the work and started to go into my community and like get to know and understand people, that there were a lot of people doing the work already. It's just they didn't necessarily see themselves as part of a community or part of a larger group. So like, I think it takes a lot of intentional time and energy to go into our communities and think and investigate who is already doing this work. Where are the places that people feel that go to resist feel safe? And who do you think of leaders? Like these are good questions that help us identify what our communities are already doing against these different forms of social inequality and climate change. And then lastly, I lost my mouse now. For my step 4, it's how can my communities support each other and build their collective futures? So here, I hope you can see the different concepts that we kind of talked about so far, like deconstructed. You know, earlier we were talking about this idea that of environmentalism exhaustion, where it's just us as an individual versus all the global problems. But through the talk, we start to see that through intersectionality, we begin to see that we actually belong to a series of communities that all interact with each other, and that we as the individuals are actually serve as connecting points for these communities. So questions I like to ask is like, how can my communities support each other and build their collective futures? what are our visions for the futures? Where do they align? Where do they contradict, and why? I fully expect them to contradict. Like if I ask each one of us what our vision for the future is in 5 years, I'm sure each one of us will give a different answer. I personally would prefer colder weather because I sweat really easily in the heat. Maybe some people here prefer really hot, like nice, not hot, too hot weather, but like nicer tropical weather. And maybe we'll disagree on that, but by talking it through, we actually can hopefully get to a point where we can move forward from that instead of just having disagreements. So I think the last question then becomes, how can I use my position within my communities to move towards our visions of climate justice for the future? Hold on. So I fully expect us to go back to these 4 questions in the discussion and conversation following this, but I want to quickly actually just go ahead and conclude I guess the lecture portion of this talk. So by just re-summarizing what we've talked about through all 3 of these sections. So, intersectionality shows us that we are people who belong to several communities. So it's not necessarily just about the identities themselves, but it's rather about who we are connected to. So instead of this idea of like, the individual versus the global, we are actually a part of all these different communities. And my network, my communities can support the other ones. I think that different systems of oppression, whether that's like climate change or sexism or racism, they often seek to break us apart and make us feel like we are alone or separate from our communities. And that can be really discouraging and hopeful, and I'm not hopeful, discouraging and like disempowering when we're talking about doing climate justice work. So intersectionality reminds us that we are a part of these many communities, and that communities are a place of potential and change. I think that global networks like Planet One or Greenpeace, where I work, become actually a really powerful space because it takes communities across the world united in order to take on these global problems. They're like people in the global south versus the global north, they will have different ideas of what climate justice looks like. And like I said earlier, it's important for us to kind of embrace these contradictions, embrace the disagreements, and actually talk through them, because that's how we can like do this global fight for climate justice across these global communities. So being able to map out our differing perspectives, help people come together and talk about our desires and the futures that we want, allows us to realize that we have the power as communities to achieve the futures these futures. So this is, my notes got really weird suddenly, so I don't know what happened. But yeah, so as such, climate change becomes yet another catalyst, a reason for us to remember that we are only as strong as our relationships. But these relationships, these ways that we're connected and positioned within our multiple communities, they are the ways in which we can dream, connect, and co-create these future visions of a green, peaceful, and just world for ourselves. Yeah, I'm going to wrap it up here. But before I turn us over to questions and discussion, I wanted to give you a few reading lists and references for kind of what has helped me think about this stuff in this way. I already mentioned Patricia Hill Collins and Kimberly Crenshaw, so I'd highly recommend that you read them if you're interested more in intersectionality as a concept. I highly recommend reading In It Together if you are, which is this framework for conflict transformation. It's basically a really good way to understand if we have a movement with different viewpoints and disagreeing viewpoints, how can we bring this together to something that transforms into a like this conflict into a justice movement. I also recommend reading Adrienne Marie Brown's Emergent Strategy. She talks about a lot of the same things there. And then lastly, this is a fiction book, Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. But I think that for me, as someone who didn't really know how to dream of futures, this book enabled me to like start thinking about futures that are centered on myself and my communities around me. Because I think a lot of futures, a lot of times when we talk about future, we're like, oh, in 2050, we'll have like flying cars or whatever. And I'm like, boo, that's boring. In 2050, Like, who do I want to be working with? Who do I want in my life every day? Like, what do I want to be doing that brings me joy and happiness? So this book like helped me kind of think about the futures in terms of individual and community levels. Okay. And I'll send this out via Planet One's mailing list after, and I already put all the PDFs in here. Some of them are better quality than others, sorry, but this way you can go ahead and read these for free if you want. And yeah, so now I think we can take maybe like a 2-minute, let's do like a 3 to 5 minute break actually. So we can come back at like 05 and then go into some questions and discussion. And then if you already have any questions about the presentation and are dying to tell us, you can feel free to put like some notes in the chat or put the question itself in the chat. And then what I'll also do right now is I'm going to exit from the facilitator view and then share this presentation with you all. So that way, during our conversation, you're able to reference any of the slides that you want to as well. Yeah, so let's take a few minute break and then we will go ahead and go into discussion and Q&A as well. And we'll be back at local time 05. Hi all, welcome back. Sorry, my computer decided to freeze in the break, which I guess is a very considerate time for it to freeze. I'll consider it for everyone except me, I guess. Me, I was just stressfully trying to get it back online in time. But yeah, I hope you got a break, managed to get some water or use the restroom or whatever you do to take care of yourself. So now I wanted to open it up for questions. I can't see the chat, or the chat from the previous, before my computer decided to die. So
There were
are there any
put
questions
in
in the
the
group chat
chat.
right now?
No. Yep.
Okay, well, I guess, does anyone have any questions, comments, things they'd like to understand more about, or things that they thought I could explain a little bit better for you all? And I'm totally okay with awkward silences of up to 5 minutes, but then after that, I kind of hit my limit. So I'll also zoom into what we talked about at the very beginning. So if you don't have any questions, then I'm also very curious to see how your understanding of intersectionality might have changed, or whether you agree or actually disagree with what I talked about today. In the previous groups, we also had some discussion about like, okay, what does it actually look like to do those 4 steps in like a climate justice campaign work? So we can also talk about that. But I'd really love to hear more about, or like to create a space where you can bring your own experiences and your own work that you're doing, as whether that's as activists or as just individuals existing on this planet and within communities. Like, yeah, we can talk about any of these, up to you all.
I think Kara wants to say something, right?
Yeah, Riley, I have a question. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about
I
the
can't hear
slide.
you.
Oh, can you hear me?
I can hear you, so this must be something on Riley's end.
Yeah.
Okay, I can hear you now. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about like going to your climate justice C and climate justice D slide. In your own experience, could you talk about how you identify certain threats for your communities, and then also how you identify what are strengths? So basically, if you could give examples about that. And sorry if you talked about it earlier. I think I went and had a restroom break when you were going over those slides, but I'd like to hear about more from your perspective, how you think of like threats and how you acknowledge like, oh, this is a threat to my community. And also on the other hand, like, oh, this is where my community is really strong and this is a strength we have.
Yeah. So I think for this, like it's good to, I'll talk about one of my experiences doing Asian American organizing. So in case y'all don't know, Asian Americans in the US are usually there for a variety of reasons, most of them having to do with how the US treated their like parent countries. So like, for example, my mom's from Taiwan, so the US like changed their immigration law to recruit a bunch of like high skilled people to come over there from Taiwan. In the meanwhile, the US bombed the hell out of like Laos and Cambodia and felt kind of bad about it. And then like invited a bunch of refugees to come as a result, because they're like, well, sorry, we bombed your country. I guess you can come here, I guess. So like, as a result, the Asian American community is like super diverse. There's a lot of different people from different socioeconomic backgrounds or different like family backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, etc. Sorry, I'm looking for one of my diagrams here. Okay, so when I did this Asian American organizing, part of what I did was both what we call a bottom-up approach and a top-down approach. So like the bottom-up approach kind of goes more with this like strengths of the communities. I guess I could like change this and rotate it so it's more like top-down. No, I won't do that. But like that breaks my metaphor. No. But like it's kind of a top-down versus a bottom-up approach, right? So when I was identifying threats to the community, I used different campus surveys, different research that was done in our area, and also just went and interviewed a bunch of people and talked to a bunch of people to try to figure out how are people feeling negatively affected by these different forms of racism on our campus. And using that information, I kind of created this report that showed these are the things that are affecting us negatively. And this is why I think we need certain resources to actually be able to address that. At the same time, I was doing what I call a bottom-up approach. So looking at the strengths of my community. So like I mentioned earlier, I used the Asian American community on my campus. You can ignore the words here, but they used to kind of think of themselves as very separate things. One time I invited one of my friends from the Khmer community or the Cambodian community to attend this Vietnamese student New Year's or Vietnamese New Year's celebration. And she's like, I don't want to go. They bombed my country or they massacred my people. And I was like, on the one hand, historically very valid. On the other hand, these people are 19 and definitely did not do that. But the US systems of all these different systems around the world of oppression led to them thinking that, oh, our communities, they can never interact with each other. They can't support each other. So because Asian America is filled with all these fun little quarrels between different countries and stuff, I did this campaign on social media where I went to these different community events and started to ask people oh, what are you really proud of about being Asian American? And then I took a photo of them, put their answer on, and then put their thing on Facebook, and invited them to follow the page. And they usually did because they're oh, it's a photo of me. I like that. I'll post that. And then eventually, these different communities started to overlap a little bit more and more because they started to see themselves as all of us belonging to this Asian American community, which is conveniently written here, even though all the other words are inaccurate for this example. And then on that Facebook page, we started doing community calendars, and then we started doing community events. And eventually we were able to use that Facebook page as a platform for doing community protests or actions against our university or for different resources that we needed. So to go back to your question, looking at these strengths and identifying threats and identifying strengths. Threats, I think, we can do this on two levels. One of them being just looking at the existing literature, the existing knowledge about all these different forms of oppression that are around the world. If we do look at climate change research, we pretty easily find that vulnerable communities or historically marginalized communities are usually more vulnerable to climate change, whether that's from rising sea levels or from increasing danger of typhoons and hurricanes or urban heat islands with communities of color in the US and around the world. People who have been historically marginalized, their communities usually live in these places that are under threat from both climate change and other social forces of inequality and injustice. But there are people usually already doing the work. So when we go into those communities and start to figure out how are people surviving still, even despite all these challenges that they are facing, who do they look to for support? What are ways that we can connect these communities? Because we are all facing these global systems of oppression, even though they manifest in different ways for us as individuals and communities based off of where we are in these systems. We all benefit from dismantling these different systems. So us being able to connect communities in itself, as well as identify who's already doing the work, is how we can kind of both identify and build upon the strength and resilience of our communities. I hope that answers your question. Does anyone else have any questions or comments or things that they want to know more about?
Maybe I can just say a reflection. I was thinking about what you said, or how you can look at intersectionality and that there is a big thinking that it's measuring different oppressions, but instead of looking at it as different identities that belongs to different communities, it feels like it's way more I don't know, what I wanna, yeah, it's just like I hadn't thought about it in that way, and it was enlightening. Yeah, and I think that maybe also gives it a more positive kind of thing, that, and then people will more likely maybe take the concept into their like activism or their work, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for sharing. I'm glad that this has been useful for you and that you've taken something away from it. One thing that I'm thinking about is, I think, was it Olga who shared about the, where'd it go? Sorry, everyone. I heard sometimes this gives people a little vertigo, but like the complexity of a problem. Olga, was that you? Okay. Like, I think that intersectionality becomes really interesting in terms of like the
Yes.
local and global systems, because when we have different communities across the world that are trying to take on a problem, that complexity that you're talking about really does come up quite often. Like, you see it in people wondering, how do we build like a green economy or like a just economy? Or you have it in people talking about how, like, should countries in the global south be expected to, like, quote unquote, develop without using fossil fuel, or questions like these. So like there's a lot of complexity in the problems that like we're trying to solve and across these communities here. So I guess I'm a little curious from your perspective, Olga, sorry to put you on the spot, but how does this understanding of intersectionality add or interact with like these ideas of complex problems that we have as a society?
Sorry, I hope you can hear me because my internet connection is pretty unstable right now. So I'm not sure if I understood correctly your question. It was very good to hear about like how can your multiple identities I don't know, change by the time, like when you were in America or when you were in Taiwan. So these identities are changing all the time, like how big is one of that and how big is the other. So what I was thinking about, that also ourselves and our identities are very complex, and it's something that it's always changing, and also the problems that we are facing are the same, and it's very interesting.
Yeah, no, I'm glad to hear that. I think maybe one thing that we can do with our remaining time, unless anyone has any more specific questions, I think we can perhaps actually run through a little bit of this exercise ourselves. So, we actually form a type of community, albeit like a very temporary and digital community, by just being in this Zoom call, but we all bring to it like our different identities, communities, and experiences that kind of, and we're all interested in climate justice. So I think, where did my question go? But the question of like envisioning our futures, which I have on a slide, which I suddenly can't find. Oh, here we are. What are our visions for the futures, and what do we think of climate justice as, or like, what is our vision for climate justice in our communities in 5 years? That was actually, I know where it is now, haha. It was at the very beginning of our presentation. So at the beginning, we didn't really have many answers to this because it's a very hard and complicated question. But let's think about like, here I have community singular, in case you didn't notice. And the reason I have it as singular is because I like to think of like ourselves bounded by different geographic communities. Like the area that I am, while I might belong to several like social communities, the areas that I can make change are usually pretty bounded to like different geographic regions, whether that's like Taiwan or, maybe I can still vote in the US, so maybe my state in the US. But for those like geographic communities or areas with their different communities inside, what do you think climate justice would look like in a community in 5 years? And the guiding questions I usually use for this, by the way, because I know it's like, like, tell me what climate justice looks like, cool, is like, where do you go to work? Where do you go to have fun? How do you get to work? Where does your family live? What does your neighborhood look like? Things like that. So it's less about like having this huge grand like policy proposal for the next 5 years, but much instead just like what would my life look like in 5 years if we were on this path towards climate justice? So if that's okay with everyone, let's maybe take 3-4 minutes, and you can just go ahead and jot that down, whether that's on a piece of paper or whether that's in our Zoom group chat. And then we can go around and share and kind of like start to examine what do these complexities, what are the contradictions, where do they align? And by the way, I think doing this future visioning is also a really good way for us to look at how these different systems of oppression overlap. Because like, for example, if I want to be able to go to work via a subway and my community doesn't have a subway right now, like what do we need in order to get a subway? Why don't we have like public transit right now? Like what is the history that leads to that? So like you don't have to answer that question right now, but like just thinking about the futures that we want often helps us understand where we are right now as well. So let's go ahead and take maybe 3-4 minutes and just go ahead and jot that down, and then we can go around and share if you're willing. And I'll put a timer on.
Hey, Riley, you said the way you like to think about that question is also like thinking about where do you go to work? Where do you like to have fun? Correct? Okay.
Yes, I was going to write them in the Zoom chat. I think I'll just write them on the slide instead.
Okay.
So while you all finish writing down your answers, I can go ahead and be first, since I think it's fair if the person who asked the questions also tries to answer them first. In my beautiful vision for climate justice in the future, I live in an apartment that has my cat and also has a bunch of plants and is like mixed housing. So like, I go downstairs and there's like shops and stuff around and like sidewalks and stuff. I hope I keep on working here at Greenpeace International. That'd be nice. And maybe like, how do I go to work? Maybe I bike there. Maybe I take a subway or something. Where do I go to have fun? I don't know. Hopefully there's like a lot of parks near where I live. Hopefully there's like, I really hope that there's like also maybe shops and restaurants that are owned by like other immigrants like me, because I find that makes me feel like my place feels like home a lot more. And yeah, my neighborhood, I guess, like I said, mixed housing, has those sidewalks, lots of plants, hopefully lots of sunlight, tree covers too. Not too cold, but also not too hot. So, you know, be impossible, but that's what I would love. Yeah, would anyone else be willing to share?
I can share. So for me, in 5 years, I wouldn't even want to think about or like not have to worry about transportation. So similar to you, Riley, like I want there to be so many like public transportation options or like safe biking options that I'm not even worried like how I will get somewhere because there's availability of like a shared resource to get there, whether it be a bus or a subway. So also quick context about me when I was thinking about my future imaginings. So I wrote down in my locations of where I'm from. I said I'm from Manila, Philippines, and Portland, Oregon, because I'm just kind of back and forth in between these two places. So basically within the context of the Pacific Rim is where I like to say where I'm from. So I was also trying to like relate like two issues that I see in these very diverse locations. And actually, even though the Philippines and Portland, Oregon, which is in the west coast of the US, are really different in so many ways. Both of them don't have great access with public transportation. I think Oregon is a little bit more secure, like there are better options, but because it's in the west coast of the US, it's still very reliant on cars. And it's similar in the Philippines, even though it's such a small country, there aren't really great public transport options. And so that was just one of my future imaginings. And I feel like it's very simple, but I love riding trains and the subway and biking. So if I could just have like an easy and safe way to do that, then I'd be really happy. And then another thing I was thinking about was like local food access, make it really easy to like access local produce and get a way to know like local farmers or people in your neighborhood and community and just the way to eat well. But that's mainly what I reflected on in the time we were given. And maybe I could popcorn to someone else to share.
Yeah, that'd be amazing.
Okay.
Annie has really great notes in there if you also want to popcorn to her, but you can also popcorn to anyone else.
Ooh, we can go over that in a sec, but I'm curious to hear from Nelly.
May I go ahead before Nelly?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah. Well, I feel like firstly today is the Independent Day of Armenia, and hence I would like to say that first of all, I would love to, in 5 years, I would love to live in a place where there's peace, so we can think about the climate more, because nowadays, because of the peace problems and feeling unsafe, it's harder to plan about the climate, because many people are like, if our safety is is not secured, then it is harder for us to think about climate justice. So that would be the first thing, to know that I live in a peaceful community. And I really, really like the ideas that were proposed beforehand. And probably I would also love to have a neighborhood or like community where people would care, because I feel like that's the most important thing. We can like propose different pictures, different things that we want, but if the people who live in the community do not care about the climate, then it is a problem, because at some point it will not work, all of the system that I have in mind. So I would love to be surrounded with people who actually care about the climate and they try to do something for it. So I would also love to, because Yerevan is pretty, like, it's on a hill. I don't know if any of you have been to Yerevan, but it is situated on like different hills. So it's very hard to bike here. I don't know how we could solve that problem, but I would love to bike to work, which is impossible now, because you can just go down and then you will never be able to make it uphill back. So yeah, I feel like having a bike and biking to work and back is like one of my dreams. To be able to live somewhere I can just bike. And yeah, just be surrounded with people who are willing to take time and do just act, on all of these ideas that I might or they might have about the future of the climate justice.
Thank you so much for sharing. I definitely have some thoughts that I want to share based off of what you just said, but I see that Nelly's also ready to go. So why don't you go ahead first, and then we can go into that as well.
Okay, hi again, everyone. I'm pretty happy to join. First meeting for me, because before I didn't have an opportunity to join any of Planet One meetings. But I was really interested in the topic of intersectionality. That's why I joined today. So I'm very thankful to you, Riley, that you, kind of described everything in a way that it was both simple and it also gave us a bit of food for thought. Well, just let's say for me personally. And if I start going through the icebreaker questions, starting from where I am from, I'm like Nare, I'm from Yerevan, from the capital. I was born, I grew up, and I lived here. Although I traveled around many countries, I stayed in some of them, but let's say most of my conscious life have been spent here in my hometown. And about the climate justice, honestly, I don't really know how it would look like in my community in 5 years, because still we are trying to put our efforts together to make community think about climate justice. And Armenia as a country and communities that live in Armenia, first of all, we lack a bit of awareness on how we can make changes for a more sustainable future for us. And Armenia itself is a very problematic when it comes to climate, sustainable development. We have many problems related to air pollution. Yerevan is one of the, let's say, is more toxic city according to statistics than Istanbul and Moscow, which are cosmopolitan megapolises, and Yerevan is very small with 3 million people. That's why this is very difficult to say, but probably a bit better than today. I live and work in Yerevan. Very often I work, I'm like a digital nomad. Very often I work from different parts of Europe. I go to have fun. I'm very much into techno music, and I'm also DJing. So I'm mostly having fun at techno clubs here. And my neighborhood is very traditional neighborhood than the one that I live in. I would say a bit also conservative in terms of accepting different cultures, points of view, and whatever is, let's say, considered foreign for them. But I also try to change some minds over here, although it's slowly, but I can see a bit of a change too. That's it. I think I was not, I didn't take the space of the other people. I'm very sorry.
No, I'm really glad you shared. Julia, I see you have your hand up, so why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, I actually recruited a friend. So this is my German friend. And he wanted to share some thoughts.
Hi, I'm Lawrence from Germany. Do you hear me well? Yeah, okay. I was like, thank you for the interesting presentation. I was thinking about your questions a lot, but I was thinking that, well, for me, I found it like important to think how I would like to live instead of where. I mean, like, for me, it would play a big role that I would like to live with less speed, and the community is has another focus, like that it's less focus on growth and more focus on stability, like homeostasis. Is this a word in English? I don't know. Like, because I see it in healthcare system. I work in the healthcare system, and it's in Germany. It's based on capitalistic system, and that doesn't work, because you cannot have a growth in like your fortune and the healthcare system in Germany. Then you like, there's no market for for, I don't know, broken knees or something like that. So it's a conception. Yeah. So I hope that we come over this conception and give a bit like get over this thought that we have to optimize everything, like, yeah, and can live with a bit of less speed and less drive to optimize ourselves, so that we can be a bit more stable with ourselves. Because I think a lot of people struggle with their individual identity, because they get loose or lost in this like stream of growing. Yeah.
No, that was really great. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
I am going to try to address a bunch of what a bunch of people just said, because I think that a lot of us, especially our friends from Armenia, you brought up this idea that like our communities, like if they don't have peace, then it's hard for them to focus on any form of climate justice. Or this idea that, you know, if we're living with such speed and drive and not caring about each other as people within our communities, then we're not able to get any of this done. So I think that like part of like the really important part of climate justice is, I just forgot what I was going to say. Let me restart my brain. Yes, okay, so I think a really important part of the climate justice work we're doing is trying to take our communities and get them to the point where they're actually able to participate in the climate justice movement. Because a lot of our communities, like if we're torn apart by war, or if we have facing different types of structural oppression, whether that's racism, sexism, insert, you know, whatever form of oppression you want here, like they don't have the capacity, the time, energy, the honestly emotional energy to like move into this discussion of like, how do I think about a future? Like, I don't know, like I said earlier, when I had friends who were like getting beat up by the police, like I was not really likely to get involved in climate justice work, because I was like, I am going to worry about my friends who are getting beat up right now, whose lives are at stake right now, as opposed to like something about like the world rising in temperature that will affect me in like 30 years. Because if I'm not alive in like one day, why would I care about 30 years from now? So like, I think that when we're doing climate justice work, we have to be able to expand our definition of impact, our definition of climate justice, to include like, what do we need to do to make it so people in our community can thrive and like make mistakes, be happy, learn, be themselves. Like, because they can only if they get to that point will they actually be able to have the energy, the capacity to think about the futures that they need and deserve. Fanny, go ahead.
Yes, like correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels like sometimes this work is also about awakening people to get them to realize that they are a part of communities, that they actually belong to groups of people, because we are so incorporated with the idea that we are individuals in the world. So is that like a correct, like we can try to like break people's like mind that they do belong, you do belong, and you are connected in many ways, and that's a strength, and you can use that strength to actually make impact and also feel more powerful and like belong to people because people want to belong. That was just...
Yes, that is 1000% right. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, Riley, for talking about that, because that's exactly what I was thinking as like being, you know, in territory that's in a war, you know, being in a war, and how are we supposed to kind of like make people, not make, but encourage people to think about climate justice when they actually care about their safety. And that's what I was thinking yesterday when I was posting about this meeting. And I'm like, how are people going to react this? How are they going to care about the climate justice that's going to happen in a, I don't know, not as near future as war is happening? So this was a very thoughtful point, I would say, that it was very interesting for me as well. How can I encourage anybody in my surroundings, and like people I know, friends, anyone, to take an action, to do something for the environment when they are you know, just worried about their safety and the safety of their beloved people, you know.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate it. It's very vulnerable of you to share this. And yeah, I think that's absolutely the point. Like, I think that unless we focus on communities, then we really easily default to this individual versus the globe. And that, like we've kind of talked about, is really just a very separating, isolating, very individual focused type way of thinking about justice. So like what you're talking about, like, how do I get my friends to actually care about this? I think the first step is just like getting your friends to feel comfortable caring about their community and having hope for their community. Like a lot of times, I remember that I used to get so beat down by like different systems of oppression. I mean, honestly, I go in cycles where sometimes I do feel this way still these days, where it's just like, I lose hope and I'm just like, why dream about a future? Like, I don't think I'm gonna make it. Like, so in that, like, having hope in itself for our communities, for ourselves, of futures that we deserve, like becomes a really radical act in itself. And like sharing that hope, sharing that vision with other people, like can inspire them and like show them that, hey, it's okay to dream of a future that we deserve. Like, yeah, we might be being torn apart by different systems of oppression, but like, you know, we can dream of ways that our communities can grow back stronger, or ways that, like, you know, when we are rebuilding from violence, like what are ways that we can do it that aren't just like the bare minimum of like, oh, I just need a place, I just need a tent to live. Like instead, like, no, like how can I build my neighborhoods back, the places I live back, in a way that like matches, like that brings us towards this idea of justice in the future. So for me, maybe that's just a silly little thing, like having neighborhoods that have bike lanes, or like when I rebuild a neighborhood, I'm like, maybe I won't just have it all be like car stuff. Or like, yeah, but I think a lot of that is just having your communities, like you're talking about, like the people in your community be like, hey, it's okay to dream of a future for myself here. And then like start to share that future with other people. And in that process of sharing futures where there is alignment and also sometimes contradiction, like usually plans kind of get made out of that. And it's a really cool and like beautiful process to be a part of. Let me see if there's anything else. Fanny, you brought up the rural versus urban divide in terms of the public transit. And I think that's like a really good example, once again, of like how, you know, earlier I talked about climate justice as both like an envisioning process and a co-creation process. So the envisioning, like I think it's important to like go to the rural communities and ask them in person, like, what does public transit mean for you? Or like, what does climate justice mean for you? Like maybe, honestly, maybe they keep on using cars. Maybe it's that there's like electric charging stations that we can use electric cars or something like that. Or like, maybe that does look like trains, but it's important for us to make sure that we can go and get their visions, because they're the ones with the lived experiences who live in those communities. But, you know, there'll probably be different contradictions and different answers based off of who they are. And then the co-creation part is trying to figure out, okay, which parts do overlap? Which parts are we okay maybe not having right now, but maybe sometime in the future we could? But which parts can we build off of for now? And, you know, there is no perfect solution. that will make everyone happy. But when we communicate and collaborate with each other, when we're not afraid of conflict and we see it as an opportunity to like figure out new ways of working and new ways of caring about each other, then like we can take steps towards the futures that we deserve. Okay. I think it seems like we are at a good stopping point for today, unless anyone has any other questions. No. Okay. In that case, I'll hand it back over to Fanny and Julia to close us out for today's session.
Should I go ahead and
Yeah,
just...
go ahead.
I'm like, who should start? Okay, thank you so much, Riley. This has have been such a like wonderful talk and lecture and like workshop. I'm so blessed to be in this call with all of you because you have contributed in an amazing way. I just want to invite you all for a really short evaluation. It will take only 2 to 3 minutes, and it's very important for us to get this like instant feedback so we can improve these kinds of events in the future. So I will share my screen and show you how to go about. So I guess that you can see my screen now, right? So by using your phone, you can scan the QR code, or you can use the link that Julia will post in the chat. And then you will see one slide with 4 statements. If you scroll down a bit and just rate the statements, and then on the other slide, there's an open question that you can just put in whatever feedback that you want to give us. And we're super thankful for this. So please take 1 or 2 minutes to do this, and we are very, very thankful for that. So just let us know if it doesn't work. But maybe we can just go ahead to the next slide. Julia, do you want to take that one or?
Sure. So yeah, so this, as I said in the beginning, this is a part of our like global program for Planet One. So we're gonna have some other global events coming up with on other topics that you're really very welcome to come to as well. So the next one is actually next week, same time on Wednesday, and it's about political advocacy and people power. And then 2 weeks after that, we have one on plastic pollution and social justice with the network called Break Free from Plastic. So you'll find all of this information on our Facebook and Instagram pages. So, but yeah, just wanted to say that you're really welcome to those two. And then just finish up with saying a big thank you to Riley. This was really, really valuable. I learned a lot, and that was really nice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. Well, I hope everyone has a good rest of their day, night, wherever they're at. And
Thank you so much.
thank you everyone for participating. I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, bye. Hope to see you.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.